So I recently went to a photo walk in Toronto and I took some nice images, and I would like to speak to you guys about these images because we can analyze the composition and we can learn something from them. Let's actually start with this one. So as you can see in this image, the entire frame is filled with cameras. So there's a lot of pattern in this frame. So when the human eye actually looks at patterns, it finds patterns interesting. Now, the patterns doesn't always have to be one similar type of pattern. Like in this frame right here, we can see that we have multiple different types of cameras that are filling the frame. And even though they are not the same in the way they are designed, we can see that because of the subject matter is similar, it's all cameras and it's filling the frame. Wherever you look in the frame, you see a different type of camera. That's what makes this frame interesting. So a good tip to improve your photography is to try to find patterns in your work and try to fill the frame with those patterns. That's a great way to improve your composition. Okay, so this right here is a building in Toronto, right? So I've shot it against the sky and I've actually exposed it to a point where we get the building which is perfectly exposed, but then the sky is washed out and it's completely white. So this, what it does is it takes our attention and puts it on the subject matter. There's nothing that distracts it from the sky. So basically, if I had exposed for the sky, we wouldn't have gotten details on the subject. And let's say I did a HDR shot and I got the details of the subject and I got the details of the sky. What's going to happen is our attention is not going to go to the subject. Our attention is going to go to the sky and the subject. But what I wanted to do in this shot is I wanted our attention to go completely onto the subject, which is this building. So I overexposed the sky and I perfectly exposed the building. Now another great tip that I have for you is to shoot in ISO 100. Now I always shoot my images in the lowest possible ISO. So what you can do is you can take a tripod, and the tripod, what it's going to let you do is it's going to let you go to lower shutter speeds. So when that happens, you get to expose your image while shooting at ISO 100, which is going to give you the most leverage in post-production, which is what I always like to do. But again, when you're shooting subjects that have motion, you have no other choice. You might have to shoot with a higher shutter speed. In that situation, I would like ramp up my ISO, but I will try to keep it between like 100 to 800. I will not try to go above 800 because I've just seen that it brings up the grain and it just kills the overall image quality. So this right here, it's a car, it's on the street. So if you look over here, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in frame. So there are balloons on top. There's each window has like designs to it. We can see people passing by, so we have some living subject matter. But again, our attention goes to this car in the center of the frame because that is our main subject matter. There's also a contrast between the colors. As you can see, the building is warm and the car is cool, so that creates some nice contrast. Over here, there's a person wearing a yellow shirt holding a red umbrella. That creates some good contrast as well. So what you do is you frame your shot. Okay, you frame your shot and you keep in mind what you want your composition to look like. And then like people are going to pass by, elements are going to move because you're shooting the street, right? But overall you have your set composition and that can be as a guide. So then you can just wait there with your set composition until something interesting happens in frame that adds to the the interest of the frame. But your composition is standard. So if you look over here, we can see that I've composed this in a way where we get these patterns of the building, and that is like a repetitive, right? On top we have these rectangular windows, that's one type of pattern. In the bottom we have these structures, that's another type of pattern. And then in the foreground we have three different cars all equally spaced, and we can actually divide the frame into half, and it's also creating that symmetry in a way. So all of these things, keeping it in mind when composing your shot, it can help you get some better compositions when you're shooting street. Okay, this is an image that I shot on Queen Street. Okay, so I've shot this vertically, and the reason I've put this image here is because I actually worked a bit with the color grade and I found that interesting. So generally when we're working with the white balance of an image, right, we try to get the white balance to neutralize the image. So if the scene is too warm, we try to set it to a cooler white balance to neutralize it. And if the scene is too cool, we try to make a warmer white balance to neutralize it. So what people need to realize is that there's no right and wrong white balance. At some situations, the scene's going to look good if the image is warm, and in some situations, it's going to look good when the image is cool. For example, in this scene right here, what I've done is I've actually made my image cool. So when I made my image cool, you can see that the entire environment is cool. It's giving a different aura to the image. Over here, we can see there are some warm elements as well, like the pole and the traffic signal, which is on orange. So all of this is giving some warm elements. And what I did is I made the entire scene blue and I ramped up the saturation for the warm elements. Okay, so that's where you can see that the stoplight, the hand over here, and then the car and even the people, right, all of them are highly saturated. We can see that the red blinker, the turn signals on all of these cars have become warm, the Tim Hortons logo. So the warm and cool contrast, it really gives an interesting feel to this image. I could have made this a perfect white balance, but then we wouldn't have had that warm cool contrast, and because we don't have that contrast, it's not going to be as interesting. So sometimes when you're editing your images, it's okay to create that type of color contrast by changing the white balance. It's completely fine. It's not that your white balance always has to be neutral. Sometimes it's okay for you to adjust your white balance to create some interesting effects like this. Okay. This right here, it's an image that I was taking while I was walking. As you can see, there's the slight motion blur. That's because I wasn't expecting the shot. I was just walking and then I noticed this moment and I captured it. It's about this person who's looking at her reflection, and it looks like the reflection is looking back at her, but you can see that there is contrast. So she is brighter than her reflection. In a way, right, the slow shutter speed, it actually makes the image more interesting. If this image was stagnant and if I'd frozen this frame with a high shutter speed, I don't think it would have been that interesting. So sometimes, right, your mistakes could actually be good. Like this image technically was a mistake because I was walking with the subject while I clicked this image. That's where you can see because of the motion blur, the signs have this little motion blur effect to it. There's a slight shake on the subject. We still have patterns to behind them, so this fencing, it gives a good pattern. And if you look at this subject matter as well, we can distinguish the subject, we can see the subject, but there is a slight blur to it, which is adding to the interest, in my opinion. So not all your images need to be perfect. Sometimes even the shots that are not the best technically executed can still be interesting if you have good subject matter. And that's another thing that you can consider when creating your images. Well, this is just an image that I shot with my friend. We were out there doing some street photography. Again, I shot at a low shutter speed, but because both of us were stagnant, we were actually frozen. But if you look at the car at the back, we can see that motion blur is happening. If you look at the person, there's slight motion blur here as well. And I'm shooting reflections, right? So sometimes it's cool to shoot reflections because we generally look at the subject matter and we try to shoot just the subject, but then we often look past the fact that reflections are interesting. So a great way to create good images, right, is to create images that have subject matter that not all people consider normal. So when we go out there and we look at the world, right, we see all these interesting things that happen outside. We can take an image and we can shoot it, and that image can be well executed technically. But anyone can shoot a well technically executed image as long as they understand how the controls of a camera work. But what really makes an image stand out is the uniqueness of the subject matter. Now this image right here, it's just me and my friend standing in front of a building and I'm shooting the reflection. Now what's interesting is not many people actually stop and observe the reflections of everyday life, right? So they're always walking, they're constantly in motion, they're going different places. Unless you're a photographer, you're not actually going to stop and you're not going to take notice of highlights and shadows and reflections and all of that in everyday life. But as a photographer, we get to show people that. We get to show people what the street of Toronto looks like when it's reflected off a building. And you can see how warm this image is, right? That's not actually a white balance thing, because you can look at the white over here and you can see the white is balanced. It's not really a white balance thing. It's more of the building, the glass was slightly orange tilted. We can see that the buildings have like orange paint to it, and the subject matter is orange because of the nature of the glass. So all of these things are just some interesting things to consider, right? Interesting subject matter will always be more interesting than a well executed image. If your image isn't well executed, it's fine as long as you have subject matter that is profound, right? So we have the technical side of photography, we have the subject matter of photography, and sometimes more than the technical side of photography, what are you trying to convey? What is your subject? That oftentimes is more important than how you execute it technically. But anyway, this right here is image that I shot more for the artistic aspect of it. So I was walking down the street, I saw this yellow fire hydrant, right? Which in itself is interesting because generally when we look at fire hydrants, they are red, but over here it's yellow. And not only that, I also noticed that the wall behind it was yellow, and there was a shop, and the store inside they had like yellow furniture and yellow wallpaper, which was really interesting. There was so much yellow in the frame. So when I saw this scene, when I was walking past the street, I noticed that I could shoot an image for color. And the color here being yellow, which contrasts well with the cool blue walls and the cool green plants, right? So contrast, it isn't always orange and blue. It can be these different type of colors as well: yellow and blue, blue and green, yellow and green. These images, they create some unique contrast visually. You can also see that there's a lot of pattern in this image. There's pattern on the brick wall, there's pattern on this railing, right? Lines. So looking at patterns, looking at colors, looking at subject matters, and how do you place the subject matter? Now let's say I had placed the subject on the side, like it makes a completely different image. There's balance. There's two boxes on the bottom, right? And two on the top. Squares, sorry. So shapes, patterns, colors, contrast. Take all of this into mind when framing your subject. It's not always just a subject. Some of the time it's these different visual elements and how they all come together to create a unique composition. So when you're out there, ask yourself some following questions before you shoot, right? Just think to yourself, what is the subject matter? What am I trying to convey? What elements are there in the particular scene? Is the color, is the contrast? And because if this same image, if I had shot this in black and white, it wouldn't have made sense. Color is what worked here. So what approach am I going to take? Am I going to take a color image, or am I going to take a monochrome image? And okay, now that all of this is placed, where do I want to place my subject matter? Do I want to place it on the rule of thirds, or do I want to center frame it? So all of these creative decisions, they all are going to impact what your final image looks like. So instead of just going out there and just looking at some interesting subject matter and clicking the shot, trying to analyze what is the best approach for shooting this particular subject matter is going to radically improve your composition. Over here, I found this car, right? This car, it was reflecting everything of its surroundings. It had this really like glossy reflective texture to it. Now, I could have used an ND filter and I could have like cut these reflections, right, with a filter, but I chose not to cut these reflections because I felt that the reflections created a lot of like interesting elements. Not only did it show like the glossy nature of the car, it also showed us what is around it. So we get an idea on what the surroundings of the car is. As you can see over here, it's placed next to another blue car, and that's working very well considering that there's only cool colors over here. There's green, there's blue, there's a lot of cool colors. The only warm colors really are the traffic signals. So the nature of this image is cool. We get to see the glossy effect, right? If you look at the floor, you can notice that I've actually like darkened the floor. So when we shoot this image, basically the floor and the car, they have the same values of light. But then when we get to darken the surroundings just a little bit so that the car stands out, when we look at the image, like our attention is going straight to the car. It's not being deviated by anything else. over here, if the floor was brighter, for example, like there was not going to be a lot of separation between the car and the floor. Like obviously our attention is going to go to the car, but it's also being attracted by all the other bright elements. So an important thing to consider when creating your images is that your eye, the human eye, it always goes to the brightest part of the frame, right? Contrast is very important. Now, if you notice, the contrast in this image is subtle, but there is contrast, and that is the reason your attention is going straight to the car, and the car being center framed also creates like attention to go straight to the car. If the car was framed in any other way, like yes, our attention would go to the car, but then it would also be pulled out by other elements in the frame. And the brightness of the car is what's making this stand out. If the frame had like equal tonal values, if everything was bright or everything was dark, even though the car's subject matter is interesting, like our attention would be like all over the place. So the type of subject matter that you're shooting, and how do you want to make emphasis onto the subject matter. So I really help pull your emphasis towards the car by darkening everything else around it, and that is a great way to create emphasis in whatever subject matter that you're trying to shoot. Over here, this was actually a building, and really old abandoned building. It had a blue door, and it had this red bricks, and it had some interesting texture. It also had plants growing on it because the building was abandoned. People weren't maintaining it well. We had plants, so I framed it in a way where what's really interesting here is the texture, the pattern, and the color. Okay, so three different colors all working well with each other. We have red, green, and blue, and in this frame we have like four different type of textures. We have the texture of this part of the wall, right? This part of the wall is one texture. We have the brick texture, we have the texture of the plants, and we have the texture of the building, which is blue, the door. So when you look at an image, right, there's always like an organic subject matter and an inorganic subject matter. And over here you can see how the organic plays well with the man-made inorganic subject matter. And often the times, like the way the subject is framed, right, it makes a big difference. So right here you can see that the leaves are curved. So if I had gone wider, in this image, it's no longer gonna have the same effect in the composition. And I'll actually pull that image up where I've actually gone wider. And in this image you can see that now that we have more of the subject matter, it's no longer interesting because our eye is going all around the frame, and there are a lot of elements that doesn't have to be there. So in this composition, I have strictly set to just a few elements, that is like 4 different types of textures and 3 different colors that work well with each other. Now, if I had gone wider and if I get the door and if I get the windows and a lot more of the plants, yes, it is interesting subject matter, but it is not as effective as this particular composition. Like this composition alone, it can be framed and it is more of an art piece because it has the various different textures and various different colors, and that's what creates interest. Sometimes less is more in photography, and the more you show, like you can show more and it's going to give you more context, but sometimes you don't always have to show context. You don't always have to like spoon feed your audience. Sometimes just the visual like variation in the frame is enough context, and we get the viewers to kind of draw connections and kind of create and think about what actually is being portrayed. So less is more sometimes. Here it's just a detailed shot of these screws. It was actually on this little device. I'm not really sure what it is exactly. I found it in this parking lot. So over here what I've done is I have played around with the highlights and shadows. I know that this has a metallic feel to it, so I wanted my attention to go here. But I also wanted the texture of the rust surrounding it to be the background. So the background is this texture of rust, and then we have this metallic texture in the front, in the foreground, which is center framed, and the patterns of the screws, they are in the center of the frame, which is actually the main emphasis. And again, what I did is play around with contrast, play around with highlights and shadows. The saturation creates contrast, and the highlights like of the screw over here, we can actually see these highlights here. These highlights being the brightest part of the image is what draws our attention, and that also being the center of the frame with a lot of pattern also makes this a really interesting image. So texture is the dominant element in this frame, and pattern, repetition, highlights drawing our attention, the center framing, and the variation of the texture. So even though there's texture, there's a lot of variation in the texture, and the similar colors, right, is what makes this image interesting in my opinion. Again, finding contrasts in colors, as you can see in this image over here, you have these orange walls, these yellow exclamation mark, and then this blue, I think it's a post box, right? All of these different variations in colors, it creates an interesting image. Now this image, right, it's very easy to execute it technically. Like anyone with the camera, they can like expose for the highlights, I mean, and then like darken the shadows, create this type of an image. Anyone can do that, right? But viewing this, viewing these colors and portraying these colors, knowing that this is what I want to show and this is how I want to frame it, because I know that these colors is what is creating like interest in the frame. Like that is something an artist can do. Like taking a camera and clicking this image, like this is a very easy image to execute. Like anyone with a camera, if they knew that this colors is what's going to make the image interesting, they can go to this particular like location and they can click this image. But it's really like that knowledge of saying, hey, I am outside in the real world and I'm out there observing, and I'm seeing these colors and I'm saying, hey, I can see some contrast here, that's going to be interesting, so let's portray that and show that to the people. That is the eye of a photographer. So a lot of photography, it comes down to how you view the world. So as you improve your skills as a photographer, you're going to improve the way that you view. So you're no longer viewing the world as a normal person, you're actually viewing the world and you're trying to find these elements and you're trying to find these color variations and texture variations and pattern recognition, and all of that comes together in the way that you view, and then the camera is just a device that's going to let you capture what you're viewing. So improving the way you view the world, that is what's going to like overall help you like become a better photographer, if that makes any sense. Same over here, contrast, right? Blue walls, red lantern, and this cute little subject matter over here. And as you can see over here, like the subject is hitting the background, but because I shot in ISO 100 and I shot in a relatively lower shutter speed, I was able to like bring up the exposure of this red lantern without losing a lot of detail, right? So you can see that the subject is clear and it's also working well with the background, and we have yellow as well, right? This little pinch of yellow over here. For this pattern and this pattern, I kind of like chose to like bring down the exposure a little bit just so that I can create these silhouettes. So silhouettes, they are always interesting in photography. I always, whenever you have a brighter background than the subject matter, it's going to cause a silhouette. So these silhouettes, what's going to happen is when you shoot a silhouette, you are focusing more on the pattern of the subject matter. So here, not only is there a good contrast between cool and warm, like we have the cool background, the red subject matter, and the yellow like pattern over here. It also, I brought in elements of silhouettes. So you can see that this pattern here is a silhouette and this pattern here is another silhouette. And not only is the viewer looking at the highly vibrant subject matter, they're also looking at the silhouette, which creates some interesting patterns. So if this silhouette, if I had actually like shot another image that was exposing for this, and if I had stitched that into the image, it's no longer going to be interesting. Like, yes, you're going to be having a little more visual information. You're going to see the color of these patterns, but the silhouette is what makes this image interesting. So because there's a silhouette, this is where our attention goes to. If this element and the other element also had color, like yes, there's going to be more color information, but then our attention is going to be distracted. It's going to be pulled to this corner of the frame, and it's going to be pulled to this corner of the frame as well. Right now the attention is going there, but our main attention is center focused, and it's focused on this thing right here, which is the main subject matter. So When do you use silhouettes? When is it okay to have dark elements in frame? Like not everything has to be perfectly exposed. Sometimes like underexposure too will create a good image. Over here, it's the same location. And over here, like remember what I told you in the start, it's cool to shoot reflections. I've shot reflections here. It is literally the same thing, but it is shot in a reflection. But this time, I chose to go monochrome. I chose to shoot black and white. Not always do you have to shoot your images in color. Sometimes it is okay to shoot your images in black and white. So when you're shooting in black and white, what you're doing is you're taking away the element of color. And because everything is now gray, there is actually, you are going to be focusing more on the tonal values, the textures and the patterns. That is what people look at when they look at a monochrome image. So here I noticed that we had all these hangings, and they had all these different patterns, right? You have the skull, we have this little guitar, we have all these patterns. And I also saw that the wall is being reflected, and the wall had all these roots on it, and they had the patterns of the bricks, and we had these windows, and we had all these different lines and cables which were also like connecting everything together. There was so much visual elements, and there was so much texture. I saw the texture, and I knew that this image would be interesting if I shot it in black and white. Yes, I could have shot it in color as well. You would have had the same, but there's going to be a lot more like distracting elements. You are going to be seeing the highlights, and like this position right here, this triangle right here, that's actually a highlight because this is actually a reflection of a store window, and that highlight would create like tonal variations. So it would be light blue, then it would be like a very bright tone of blue, and then it would go back to dark blue. So all of these tonal variations, it's all creating interest in the frame, and I would take that into consideration when shooting monochrome and creating contrasts and patterns. It's better to shoot monochrome in some situations and color, and really you get to choose when to shoot monochrome and when to shoot color, and that creative decision is up to you as a photographer. Sorry about that, guys. I had to change locations, but now I am back and we have some more images to talk about. Now look at this image right here. This is of a fruit stand, right? They had a bunch of apples and other fruits. So when I look at this, I actually saw like colors, right? We have red fruits and we have green fruits. And I also noticed like we have the patterns, the repetitive patterns and shapes, right? So we have the shapes of the baskets, which are all circles, and we have the shapes of the boxes, which are squares, right? So that's really interesting. And then I also saw that the highlights was hitting the subject, the sunlight. The sun was setting at the time, so we got this nice warm golden light that was hitting the subject. And what I ended up doing is I ended up exposing for the highlights. As you can see, the sun was a little harsh, and the harsh light was creating some dark shadows. It was also creating some interesting textures on the fruits as well, right? So we see harsh highlights, it really brings out the texture. So understanding the quality of light can help you make better creative decisions. So sometimes when you're shooting with hard light, shooting subjects that have a lot of texture, that is really interesting, because what's going to happen is when you shoot these type of subjects with a lot of texture, when you shoot it in hard light, it's really going to help emphasize the texture. So over here, it's not only the texture of the fruits like this, right? It's also the texture of the baskets, and you can see that that texture is emphasized as well. The same image, imagine this image with soft light. That would have no longer had the same type of effect. Now, creating contrast and identifying the quality of the light. And that quality of the light, you can help position your camera and position the frame in a way that emphasizes the subject matter. What is the nature of the subject? What is the color of the subject? And is the light helping the subject like really get the meaning out, the message out? Sorry. Similar thing over here. As you can see, it's slightly overexposed, and I wanted to just show you this image just so that you can get an idea on what I'm talking about. Over here we can see that the fruits, it's hit hard light is hitting the subject, and the fruits textures are coming out. Sorry, fruit textures are coming out, but you can see that the fruits, they all have these wrappers on it, and because of the hard light hitting the wrappers, we're getting these spots of highlights. These spots of highlights, they don't have any details, and you really can't like bring back details in this, right? So understand, like if an image is underexposed, we can ramp up the exposure and we can bring back some of the details. But if an image is overexposed to the point where, sorry, point, if an image is overexposed to the point where the highlights take away all the details, we call it like a washed out image. So like sections like this, where the highlights have completely taken out all the details and we can't see any more details, the highlights are washed out. So if the highlights are washed out, you can't really bring back details of the subject matter. If there are enough highlights to show details, then we can play around with the values. We can bring down the highlights and we can bring up the highlights. We can bring up the shadows. We can make the shadows darker. But in a situation, in a scenario where the highlights are bleached, the highlights are washed out, in that type of a scenario, we can no longer recover details from the subjects. So hard light, soft light, understand when to use it. There are some times where it works with the subject matter and sometimes where it doesn't. Hard light, it can help create a good feeling of contrast, just like these two images right here, but it doesn't always work in all scenarios. Again, shooting through reflections, remember I said that. This is a monochrome image that I shot at a store in Toronto. We can see the way everything is arranged in display, right? Now I shot through reflections, and because you shoot through reflections, you're not only getting what's in the store, but we're also getting what's happening outside, right? So we can see that there's a car that's passing by on the street, and we have all of these images, these textures, and it's a texture heavy image. So when you're shooting texture heavy images, shoot it in black and white. When we're shooting reflections like this image in color, yes, it would be an interesting image, but then like you see this car, you see these outside elements, right? We would still have them in the frame, but it would be too much of a distraction. There would be variations in colors that will take away from the actual subject matter. We don't want that. We want our image to, when we look at the image, we do not want to be distracted by elements that doesn't add to the narrative, if that makes sense. The same image, if in color, we're going to see the color of the car, we're going to see the color of the streets, and that's going to take away from what I'm actually trying to show the viewers, which is the overwhelming texture and the interesting subject matter. The car in the background, which is actually a reflection, that is interesting. But if that was a colored image, that is going to take away, it's going to be an unnecessary element that distracts. Sometimes taking away that color, taking away the elements that are distracting, and just having the texture and just having the patterns and just having the subject matter derive from like what is being seen, and actually taking away these distracting elements, that is sometimes very powerful. Like as I said in an earlier image, less is more in photography. Sometimes taking away some elements and just having the image like as it is in a monochrome setting, right, is what's creating interest in this image. And making that creative decisions on the spot is very important. Always remember to shoot raw, because you don't always have to shoot JPEG. You can shoot raw, and let's say you go into post-production, like you will get the color image and then you can decide to shoot in monochrome. You can decide to change it in Lightroom. So that's very important. This right here, right, look at this image. It's a texture heavy image. And I shot this in Graffiti Alley. There's graffiti everywhere. We see these two cars that are parked and it's surrounded by trash, right? We also see like the green plants and the steps and how highly contrasted that is. And it's just exposed to a point where we get details everywhere. And yes, the sky is bleached out on the top left part of the frame, but even though that's white, it has so many like elements there. Like we have the color of the leaves and we have the silhouette of the stairs, that even though it is overexposed, it's not really that distracting. So let's say in this area, this part of the frame, all we saw was just overexposed sky. That would be a big chunk of overexposure, and that would distract the subject. But right now, because it's taking up a very small part of the frame, it is acceptable, and majority of our attention is going to what subject matter is in the frame right here. So we have this dumpster with all the graffiti, we have the trash, we have the two cars, and we have the textures everywhere. That's what's making the subject interesting. Taking that all away would actually remove from the messaging of the image. What message are you trying to convey? I keep emphasizing this. And it might seem like a repetitive point. Why does he keep saying, what are you trying to convey? But majority of photography is what are you trying to convey, and a little bit is how you try to convey it in terms of technical execution. And this is a great example of that. A very highly textured image where, and there's also a narrative, right? It's telling a story. So what are you trying to say? What type of story is it? We can see over here the light is soft. The light is soft in this image, and because the light is soft in this image, we can see that it has a completely different effect. Now let's imagine the light was harsh in this image. It was going to create contrast. Sometimes we don't need a lot of contrast. In this image, the contrast is there, but the contrast is really subtle, and that's what's making this image an interesting image. And yeah, that's all the images that I had that I wanted to show you during my last photo walk. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, share, and subscribe. I hope you guys learned something from this. And I really like sharing my photography and helping people improve their photography just by learning what I do. And I am constantly learning as well. So you can always like check out my work on my Behance. I have a little more detailed work. I also have a lot of portraiture on my Behance, a lot of travel photography. This is a set of images from just one photo walk. But if you actually want to go in detail and look at the type of work that I produce, I will be linking my Behance down in the description. I will also be linking down my Instagram if you'd like to connect and talk about your work. And if you want to share your work with me, and if you'd like me to like review your work and critique your Instagram, critique your portfolio, I will be happy to do so. Just send me a DM on Instagram. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.